I inherited $3,600,000 from my parent, so please divorce me. You're useless.
Hearing the sudden news of inheriting $3,600,000, I realized that my father-in-law was indeed incredibly wealthy. However, I had mentally prepared for this situation, so I promptly presented the divorce papers I had prepared in advance to my husband. Is that okay? Here's the divorce form. Despite being surprised by my efficiency in having the divorce papers ready, my husband quickly regained his composure and signed the divorce document. My name is Amy, a 50-year-old company employee. My husband, Michael, and I have a 20-year-old son who is currently in college. Since my son became independent after starting university, I've been actively involved with an NPO that supports people in need. While I couldn't provide financial assistance, I had the time to contribute by helping with food distribution and other volunteer activities. Witnessing the grateful expressions of those who received meals during these events made me forget the daily troubles. It was the perfect escape from the self-centered and money-focused mindset of my husband. Our son moved out to live on his own when he entered college, but my husband and I reside in a second-hand house. Originally, this house belonged to my grandparents, but after they both passed away, it remained vacant. We renovated it and made it our home. 3 years ago, when my father passed away, I officially inherited this house. I have a brother, and during the inheritance discussions, it was straightforward. My brother inherited the family land and property where he lives with my mother, while I received this house. Besides these two properties, there were no significant assets to consider. However, given my husband's wealthy family background, I always felt that any future disputes might be more complicated. My father-in-law runs a successful business and possesses considerable wealth. He's a shrewd entrepreneur who expanded the company significantly in a single generation, and my brother-in-law grew up witnessing his business acumen, which made him strict. On the other hand, my husband was pampered by his mother, resulting in a typical spoiled child upbringing. He lacks a deep understanding of life's hardships. Even after joining my father-in-law's company, my husband's ego inflated due to the constant flattery he received. Unfortunately, this led to some reckless decisions. When contracting with a company that is a rival of an important business partner, my husband, a mere employee, lacked the authority to finalize the deal. However, without consulting my father-in-law or brother-in-law, he proceeded with the contract, resulting in complaints from the major business partner. After several such incidents, my father-in-law's patience wore thin. He decided to transfer my husband to a subsidiary company. My stricter brother-in-law even suggested firing my husband. Then my husband got angry and promptly submitted his resignation letter to both my father-in-law and brother-in-law. The resignation letter was promptly accepted, but since we had just gotten married, my mother-in-law tearfully pleaded with my father-in-law to somehow find a new job for my husband. Reluctantly, my father-in-law introduced my husband to his current company, ensuring he didn't remain unemployed. Given my husband's lack of experience in job hunting, securing employment without connections would have been challenging. When he quit my father-in-law's company, he boldly told me,
I can't showcase my talents there. Neither Dad nor my brother appreciates my abilities.
Yet, in the end, it was my father-in-law's recommendation that secured his new job. Reflecting now, I wonder why I married such a pitiable husband and feel a tinge of regret. Since my husband left the company, his relationship with both my father-in-law and my brother-in-law deteriorated. He became reluctant to visit his parents' house during holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving. Instead, my mother-in-law, who dotes on my husband, comes to our house more often. My mother-in-law exuded an unmistakable air of wealth and refinement. She never engaged in any mistreatment towards me, and I genuinely liked her. However, not long ago, she passed away. My husband was devastated, so much so that he couldn't even eat for a while. During the funeral, he remained in tears, leaning on me for support. But when the topic of inheriting my mother-in-law's estate arose, my husband's demeanor suddenly changed. He became assertive.
Mom was worried about me, so I should receive the entire inheritance.
Although I wasn't part of those discussions, when I went to serve tea during the meeting, the atmosphere was so tense that it made me recoil. My husband had high expectations for a substantial inheritance from my mother-in-law, but the reality fell short. He felt even more despondent than during the funeral. Perhaps he was shocked by the realization that he wouldn't have his mother's assistance moving forward. For a moment, I almost respected my husband, thinking he genuinely cared for his mother. However, upon realizing that he merely coveted her wealth, disappointment and anger surged within me. I knew well that my self-centered husband wasn't a kind or admirable person. My husband dislikes my volunteer work, often belittling it by saying,
"Working for others without receiving any compensation. Aren't you just indulging yourself?"
Ever since I began assisting the homeless through an NPO, he has expressed disapproval and anger. Despite my volunteering causing him no inconvenience, my husband seems to find my actions displeased. Lately, I've quietly continued my volunteer work because I genuinely enjoy it. His self-centeredness has made me increasingly resentful. Since our son moved out, our conversations have dwindled, and I've lost sight of the purpose of living with my husband. Although he relies on me for household chores, I find life easier when I'm alone. Our financial situation has also changed significantly since my husband switched jobs, and he contributes very little to our expenses. It's mostly my salary that sustains us, including covering our son's tuition. When I seriously began contemplating our future as a couple, my father-in-law fell seriously ill and was hospitalized. I hurried to visit him, but my husband refused to accompany me.
"I won't visit a parent like that. You go alone."
I retorted. "What are you saying? He's your father. Regardless of your strained relationship, that's heartless." Leaving my unyielding husband behind, I headed to the hospital. My father-in-law's condition was worse than I expected. He couldn't even engage in conversation. Since my husband didn't show up, and it was only me, relatives bombarded me with questions.
Why isn't Michael here at a time like this?
Caught off guard, I reluctantly fabricated an excuse. He's feeling under the weather, and he doesn't want to risk infecting Dad. My brother-in-law, however, saw through my lie. As I prepared to leave, my brother-in-law pulled me aside.
Prepare yourself, as Dad's condition is quite serious. Michael isn't reliable, so if the worst happens, please be ready to assist.
His serious expression conveyed the gravity of my father-in-law's condition. Upon returning home, my husband immediately bombarded me with questions about my father-in-law's condition.
"How is Dad? Is he still okay?"
His insensitive curiosity infuriated me, and I snapped back. "If you were so concerned, why didn't you come with me? Your father's condition wasn't good." My husband's response was even more callous.
"Maybe the old man will finally kick the bucket. It's karma for firing me."
It's been nearly 20 years since he left his father's company, yet he still harbors resentment. As my brother-in-law warned, my husband wouldn't be of any help if something happened to my father-in-law. Instead, he'd likely be a hindrance. I suspect my husband is already calculating how much of the inheritance he'll receive when my father-in-law passes away. Seeing his heartlessness, I can't help but feel disappointed. When my brother-in-law urgently contacted me about my father-in-law's critical condition, my husband's reaction was far from empathetic. Instead, he seemed delighted and insisted that I should witness his father's final moments.
"Please go in my place and be there for Dad,"
he said with his usual cavalier attitude. Seeing that smile on my husband's face, I resolved that I could no longer live with this man. Subsequently, I informed our son about my father-in-law's situation over the phone and headed to the hospital alone. Our son arrived around the same time, surprised that his father wasn't there.
Wait, Dad isn't coming?
He asked. I could only respond with a troubled expression. Yeah, he'll come later. Don't worry. Perhaps my son sensed the truth from my face because he refrained from asking further about his father. My father-in-law passed away quietly, surrounded by relatives other than my husband. I considered contacting my husband, but the memory of his jubilant expression made me uncomfortable. I ignored his repeated calls afterward. Upon returning home, my husband was furious that I hadn't answered his calls. But when I finally broke the news of my father-in-law's passing, his anger instantly transformed into a smile. Even our son, who returned home with me, looked incredulous at my husband's behavior. My husband did attend my father-in-law's funeral, but he didn't bother greeting the guests. Instead, he sat there, grinning at his smartphone. It seems that he was browsing real estate information and searching for condominium properties. Curious, I half-jokingly asked him, "Are you planning to move into a high-rise condo?" His expression turned serious, and he snapped back,
It's none of your business. Just go away.
It was clear he was genuinely considering purchasing a high-rise condo. But frankly, it didn't concern me. I knew that once he inherited my father-in-law's estate, he'd likely buy a high-rise condo and move out of our current home. The house I inherited from my grandfather was showing signs of wear and tear, so perhaps it was time for a rebuild. So I was considering disposing of my current home and moving to an apartment for living alone. Still, for now, my priority was my father-in-law's funeral. The funeral of my father-in-law proceeded smoothly under my brother-in-law's management. As I breathed a sigh of relief, I noticed my husband was the only one looking cheerful. Throughout the funeral, he had suppressed discussions about inheriting my father-in-law's estate, but now that it was all over, he seemed desperate to claim his share.
Hey! Let's split Dad's inheritance already. It's just the two of us as heirs, so half each should be fine, right?
He said, grinning. Witnessing my husband's pitiable behavior, I promptly excused myself from the scene. Although I initially thought that dividing the inheritance between two siblings would be straightforward, it turned out to be more complicated. The issue arose because much of my father-in-law's wealth was tied up in company stocks. My brother-in-law proposed,
As promised, I'll transfer half the company shares to you. Is that acceptable?
But my husband, fixated on cash, remained dissatisfied.
Who needs stocks? Give me cash.
He insisted. My perplexed brother-in-law eventually involved a lawyer in negotiations. Since my husband adamantly refused any non-cash inheritance, they settled by having my brother-in-law buy out my husband's share of the stocks. After their discussion concluded, my husband returned home and promptly summoned me.
Hey, I've inherited $3,600,000 from my father. Let's get a divorce. You're useless anyway.
Upon hearing the sudden mention of $3,600,000, I was once again reminded that my father-in-law was incredibly wealthy. Most people would undergo a transformation with such a windfall, but my husband remained unchanged. His arrogance and selfishness had always been there. However, I had mentally prepared for this scenario. I promptly handed him the divorce papers I had prepared in advance. "Are you okay with this?" "Here you go, the divorce papers." My efficiency surprised him, but he quickly regained his composure and signed the divorce document. After my husband signed the divorce papers, I had a conversation with him about the future. "This house is already old, so I'm going to dispose of it. Since we're divorcing, You should leave immediately. His triumphant grin revealed his plans.
I'll move to a high-rise condo. But you? Well, this rundown place suits you, doesn't it?
Watching him walk away, I realized how absurd it was to spend over 20 years with such a heartless man. After my husband left, I promptly rented an apartment and sold our previous home. The sale fetched a surprisingly substantial amount. While my husband's $3,600,000 inheritance seemed impressive, it paled in comparison. Still, it provided ample funds for my retirement. Our son didn't oppose our divorce. My husband rarely spent time with him or engaged in father-son activities, so their relationship was strained. For our son, as long as his father supported him through college, he seemed content. My apartment has a spare room, welcoming our son whenever he wants to visit. Meanwhile, my ex-husband bombarded my phone with calls after our divorce. I ignored them, fearing he'd boast about his new high-rise condo. Even though the calls kept coming in large numbers, and I wondered if something significant had happened, I chose not to worry since we were already divorced. It's possible that my self-centered ex-husband was calling to report that he had remarried a younger woman. However, over time, the calls stopped, and I completely forgot about my ex-husband. After the divorce, I continued my volunteer work. It was a winter about a year after parting ways with my ex-husband. I was serving meals to the homeless during a soup kitchen event. As the cold weather set in, I worried about those living outside. While distributing meals, a disheveled man suddenly shouted,
Amy, why didn't you answer my calls?
His face was covered in stubble, and he looked emaciated. Although I sensed familiarity in his weak voice, I couldn't immediately place it. But then it hit me, he sounded like my ex-husband. Michael? I blurted out. When we were married, he had been of average build, but now he was a mere shadow of his former self. I asked other volunteers to take over, and then I inquired about my ex-husband's situation. It turned out that the man who had once boasted about inheriting $3,600,000 was now standing in line for a homeless soup kitchen. His hunger was evident as he finished his meal before speaking.
Shouldn't have invested in cryptocurrency,
he muttered. Apparently, after inheriting the $3,600,000, my ex-husband had initially considered moving into a luxurious high-rise condo. However, he stumbled upon stories of people multiplying their wealth through cryptocurrency trading online. Believing he could do the same, he dove into crypto trading as a complete novice, consistently losing money. Instead of quitting while he was ahead, he kept pouring funds into the volatile market, hoping for a miraculous turnaround. Unfortunately, a sudden cryptocurrency crash wiped out the remaining money he had earmarked for the high-rise condo. His bank account balance, once $3,600,000, dwindled to zero. Unable to pay utility bills, he found himself living in the high-rise condo without electricity or running water. Even his phone service was cut off. He had been calling me repeatedly, seeking help, but I had no idea any of this had happened. Even if I had known, I wouldn't have felt inclined to assist. Moreover, he couldn't afford the hefty inheritance tax, so he lost the high-rise condo he had once flaunted. The inheritance tax on $3,600,000 was quite substantial, and after selling the condo to settle other debts, it appears that nothing was left. Now, for the past month, he had been sleeping rough in parks and had come to the soup kitchen that day.
Amy, can't we get back together? I've realized I need you after all.
He clung to me, pleading. I understood that he was going through a tough time, but reconciliation was out of the question. That's impossible. Absolutely impossible. Do you remember what you said when you initiated the divorce? You called me useless. Now, suddenly, I can't forgive that. Why don't you go to your brother's place? I replied firmly. My ex-husband shook his head.
If I could do that, I wouldn't be here.
What do you mean by here? Well, it doesn't matter. We're practically strangers now.
Please don't be so cold.
Who was the one who started this coldness? Since I regularly volunteer here, feel free to come if you want. With that, I pushed him away and walked off. Watching my emaciated ex-husband eat the soup kitchen meal, I couldn't help but think that he should never have inherited that $3,600,000. Afterward, he stopped coming to the soup kitchen, and I wondered what had become of him. But it was all of his own making. When I shared this story with my son, he echoed similar sentiments. My ex-husband served as a cautionary tale, and I hoped my son would live a more responsible life. My modest apartment wasn't a luxurious high-rise condo, but it provided a comfortable life. My son enjoyed visiting during breaks, and I looked forward to witnessing his growth.
How did you like this story? Please consider subscribing to the channel. See you in the next video.